This is Shorebirds Lite, and it's intended to get you ready for the late summer push. You might be wondering why this is a good time for a class on shorebirds. And the simple reason is that May and June are really the height of the breeding season of shorebirds in the Arctic. So we see a lot of shorebirds disappear from our area during those 2 months. And then many of them come back and they spend the entire winter with us. That's where we are right now, where lots of shorebirds have already begun returning, and we're seeing great numbers of western sandpipers, and both dowitchers, the least sandpiper. These are southbound migrants. In many cases, they stop here and they remain with us for the entire winter. We also have a constant flow of arrivals that are a bit late in arriving. Typical wintering species in our area are western sandpiper, least sandpiper, the two dowitchers, Wilsons, and well, the sandpipers actually, and the dowitchers, because they stay the entire winter. Some birds arrive in our area a bit late, like Dunlin. We're seeing very small numbers of those right now, but we'll see many more numbers later on, next month or so. And then petrel sandpiper is a late arrival, who is a very long distance migrant, flying many of them all the way to Patagonia. So if they come from the high Arctic circle and they fly all the way to Patagonia, they often get an early start and they're often delayed along the way, and they pass through our area fairly late on their way south. We also have a curious phenomenon with our phalaropes, particularly red-necked, which we see briefly in spring, and then we see again this time of year, late summer and early fall. That's because they also breed in the Arctic, but they spend their winters far to our south. So they fly up north through our area and then again on the way south after breeding. So I just want to pause there for a second and ask if anybody has any questions about why this is a good season, or how to interpret those maps, or what the various dashes mean. If you do have a question, just chime in. Otherwise, I will keep going. So I want to talk first about the easy stuff. I know there's a lot of anxiety about shorebirds. There's a lot of anxiety about gulls. And I want to reassure you all that you're already familiar with a lot of shorebirds. Some of them are easily identified even by their silhouette. The long-billed curlew, for example, the black-bellied plover, the willet. These are all fairly easy to identify by silhouette alone. In the absence of field marks, in the absence of sound, you recognize the shape, you recognize the size of these. And among these would be our figurehead for Scvba, the American avocet. American avocet during the winter is fairly drab, black, white, and frosty gray. And here's I'm hoping that you were able to hear that sound. That's the typical call of the American avocet, probably when someone's near its nest, because it's very aggressive and very vocal at that time. As the bird molts from its winter plumage to its spring plumage, it passes through a period which is sort of halfway through. It's a pale peachy color tinted with a pale gray. It just begins to blush, in fact. And the same thing happens 6 months later as it's transitioning from breeding season to wintering season. Here we see the bird in full summer plumage, and you might have noticed something that happened with the bill between this picture and the previous picture. We're able to tell male and female apart by the shape of the bill, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. This would be a typical female for the American avocet. The bill is strongly upturned, very slender, lengthy, and it uses that upturned bill with that peculiar shape to kind of sift through the very upper layer of the water or the liquid mud. So it's sweeping its bill left and right to filter out small invertebrates like brine shrimp or other small soft-bodied invertebrates, which it snatches from the surface or just below the surface by virtue of that kind of almost spoon-shaped bill. When I was saying that the male and female could be told apart by the shape of the bill, I think a lot of you already know this, but I can't assume that everybody knows anything at this point. So I'm gonna say some things that might be obvious to you, and please don't be offended. The male and female's bills are different in shape, the female being much more strongly upturned, the male generally straighter. And it's very common for males and females to have different lengths or even different shape bills among our shorebirds. Avocet's the classic example with a very different shape to the bill. With regard to that bulbous shape on the forehead of the female, I don't know if that's a reliable feature or just artistic license, but I do know that the bill is a really trustworthy way of differentiating between the males and the females. I also notice when I see flocks of avocets, the wonderful disruptive pattern that these birds have. When they form a tight flock and they're flying rapidly, it's really chaotic and hard to pick out an individual. And I would remind you that that's kind of the same adaptation that zebras have. So it's a good way of avoiding a predator, at least for an individual to avoid a predator, because it's difficult for that predator to pick out a single bird or a single zebra in a group with that disruptive pattern. The microhabitat within the Bay Area that I find the avocets most often is like this: shallow saline ponds, brackish water often, easy for the bird to wade through without getting too deep, and also easy for it to find the food that it likes, the small invertebrate prey, the brine shrimp, etc. So it uses its bill sweeping left and right in these shallow ponds here, walking slowly along the edge. And for me, at least, this is the habitat I always imagined for the American avocet. And I'm going to be showing you microhabitats for most of the species in this presentation. Now on to our next easy species, which I'm sure everybody is already familiar with, the black-necked stilt. It's a handsome black and white killer whale patterned bird. If you look at the mark over the eye and the white face, etc., it reminds me of an orca. It's pretty quarrelsome, pretty vocal, and has this persistent call, which it gives when it's agitated or when it's feeling threatened. Again, the male and female can be told apart fairly quickly, but not by the shape or the length of the bill. In this case, the two sexes have similar length and similar shape bill. But if you notice the back of the female, it's brownish or kind of charcoal. So with the male, it's jet black and sometimes even glossy. And with the female, it's non-glossy and more brownish or grayish. It's fairly easy to pick these birds apart, male and female, when you see them together. In a large flock, you can even see them here. It looks like there might be one male in this group, and the second from the top left. All the others appear brown-backed, probably females. Now, I have to say that these birds are so aggressive on the breeding grounds that if you get too close to the nest, they will bombard you, calling loudly and then flying straight towards your face with this sharp bill. Something to watch out for, because I think they mean business. The habitat that they like is slightly different in that I tend to see them in areas where there's a bit more vegetation. And in this case, I believe the water here at the Palo Alto Baylands is a bit deeper. So we have a combination of deeper water and some protective vegetation around there. And the stilt would be walking around the edges or right out in the middle of this pond by virtue of those very long legs, which allow it to stand above the water without its body getting wet. Willet. Again, a very familiar species. During winter, it's pretty nondescript, pretty grayish. It's a big, bulky bird with a fairly heavy, medium-length bill and grayish legs. To me, that sounds like pillow-wheel willet, pillow-wheel willet, and that's exactly how the bird got its name, willet, by that call. And a friend of mine many years ago when I was struggling to learn my shorebirds asked me the question, will it have stripes? And it's just a fun way of remembering that willets do indeed have really obvious stripes on the wings. And in this case, you can see that for sure. These are very pronounced, very contrasty wings that are obvious at a great distance. Now, you might have noticed the difference between this winter bird and this spring bird. Here, the appearance of spots and bars in spring make it very different, in fact, surprisingly different from the winter birds that we see all the time. We don't get to see as many of these and this plumage because they don't breed here. They breed elsewhere. Some of them breed in Sierra Valley up north of here in the Sierra. Most of them breed southern Canada and inland from here. But will it have stripes? Yep, they sure do. They have really bold markings on their wings too, but in this case, I don't look at it as being such a disruptive pattern. I look at it more sort of a recognition pattern, a way by which they can recognize members of their own genus, members of their own species. So they are drawn to that wing pattern when they see it flying at a distance. Perhaps it means there's danger nearby. Perhaps it means it's time to migrate. It means something to the other birds, and they're very gregarious. And the places that I see it more often in large numbers would be places like A16 in El Viso, which is the pond right above the educational center in El Viso, the Don Edwards. So this wide open area gives ample foraging ground for the willet to walk along the edges or even walk in the water. Again, picking food from the surface, but also probing in the mud when it can find it for invertebrates like worms and things like that. Black-bellied plover, another very recognizable species, especially in this plumage. This is why it has its name, the black-bellied plover. And all plovers, in fact, are ambush foragers, which means they run quickly before stopping suddenly, and they forage by sight. So they're not really they're not really listening or probing at all, they're watching. And their fairly large eyes mean that plovers excel at foraging in lower light. So they have exceptional eyesight, they can see a great distance, they can also detect small movements, and they can hear small movements just below the surface or right on the surface. So black-bellied plovers, as they're so called in the United States, has a very mournful call. But in fall, they lose that black belly and they start taking on this mottled gray appearance. Now, in some cases, this fall bird might take on a tannish quality. This one seems to be moving toward tan, but it's still very grayish, I would say. When they begin to look a bit tan, it's fairly easy to mistake them for Pacific golden plover. We'll get into how to tell those apart shortly, but just be aware that occasionally black-bellied plovers do resemble golden plovers when they take on more of a golden hue. Thankfully, that's not very common. But what they always have, which the Pacific golden plover lacks, are these black armpits. These are called axillaries. And they're right at the armpit of the wing, and they're black in every plumage for the black-bellied plover. Likewise, black-bellied plovers always have a pale rump. So you can see it just below the arrow, the white rump there is very different from any of the golden plovers that we might come across in rare situations. So black-bellied plover, very common, very large plover. And it's very fond of mud flats where it searches for food on or just below the surface by watching for movements or bubbles, things of that sort. So it's common to see a Charleston slough either walking along the edge or even strolling a little bit into the water, but mostly foraging on the mud, soft, deep mud. Killdeer. Killdeer is very common, very familiar, but it's something we see less often when we go to the Baylands or Charleston Slough than you might think, because They're really widespread and they're very diverse in their choice of habitat. And while there are plenty in those areas, they're more common elsewhere. Uh, that piercing call is how it gets its name, killdeer, killdeer, killdeer. Um, and you'd be surprised, well, I'm surprised and somewhat embarrassed at how frequently I mistake a killdeer in flight for a falcon, because they've got long pointing wings and they have a really direct, very fast flight with that long tail, which sometimes look blunt. So it can be mistaken for a falcon. And then even when you see the rufous tail, it's not impossible to mistake this for a kestrel. But hopefully you would notice some of the other things like the bar on the breast and all of that, which would differentiate it from the kestrel or any other falcons. That reddish rump is, of course, a distraction display, and every single species of plover has some sort of distraction display. They do it when they feel threatened, or more accurately, when their nest is being threatened. So if you've been fortunate enough to see this in person, and I have many times, you get too close to a nest, probably by accident, unintentionally, you get too close to a nest, and the adult will start limping away pitifully, as if it's desperately wounded, and it will lift its wing or feign a broken wing, and it'll show this what looks to a predator like a wound on its back or on its rump. This will draw you away, whether you know it or not, from the bird's nest. And when it feels you're safe enough from the nest and there's no way of you finding it ever again, it'll burst back into health and fly away, leaving you there standing dumbfounded in the middle of a field. Places where they're frequently found nesting are like this. This is the kite flying area at Shoreline Park. The gravel substrate here and the short grass are perfect for killdeer nests. And they're laid directly on the ground with no fanfare. And they look very much like stones. And if you didn't know this nest was here, you probably would never see it. But if you do get close to it, the adult will let you know. And just for fun, I wanted to show you a picture of a young killdeer. All shorebirds are what we call precocial, and the opposite of that is altricial. Precocial means that the bird, as soon as it's hatched, is essentially independent. Now, it may hang around the parent for a while because the parent can show it where to find food and might even show it how to capture food, but very seldomly brings food to the young. The young are in charge of feeding themselves. They do it through imitation and by visual learning. Altricial would be all of our songbirds that are completely helpless and blind and must be fed and are entirely flightless for many weeks. The killdeer young are also flightless, but they're quite rapid on their feet and they're quite capable of hiding when they see danger. But that young killdeer reminds me an awful lot of semi-palmated plover. Now you can see here how one might mistake semi-palmated for a young killdeer because it's just a little bit bigger than a young killdeer. You can see the killdeer in the back in the distance is much larger than the semi-palmated plover, but there's also the difference in the number of rings around the neck. Killdeer always has two, semi-palmated just has one. It's a wonderful, adorable, cute, small plover. And just like the killdeer and just like the black belly, it's got a distraction display to keep you far from the nest. This bird nests in the Arctic, however, so we're not likely to come across the nest. But in spring, it's fairly vividly colored, like it is now, or like it was now. And you can sort of imagine that as being a peculiar variation on the killdeer call. It's two syllables, pee-whip, pee-whip. And a lot of our small banded plovers, these collectively killdeers, snowies, and semi-palmated are called banded plovers, whereas the black-bellied and the golden plovers are mottled plovers. These banded plovers all have similar calls. They all have distraction displays. And even though there's not a huge difference between summer and winter, they do sort of dull out during the winter. And this is what we're beginning to see right now. As I said, these birds winter in the, breed in the Arctic. So they're really just arriving here now to spend their whole winter with us. In flight, they're kind of compact and pudgy looking. They're a little bit larger than the western sandpiper, but still quite small. And they're often calling while they're flying. And they also flock with the western and least sandpipers on occasion, so you can see them together. And like the black-bellied plover, it's really fond of soft, deep mud where it forages for food on the surface that it finds by sight. And if we were at Charleston Slough right now, looking over this marsh and the water level were at this level, we'd probably see dozens, if not 20, scores of black-bellied and semi-palmated. Snowy plover. I put this in the easy section because to me it's fairly straightforward. It's like a bleached out semi-palmated plover, but you'll notice that the dark bars on the neck do not meet. Excuse me, can you mute?
小米粥嘛。
Junyan, can you mute, please? Yes, thank you. So the dark bars on the neck do not meet underneath the chin like they do the semi-palmated or the killdeer. It kind of reminds me in a couple of ways of the collared plover, so the collared dove. Not only in the placement on the incompleteness of that dark mark on the neck, but also the bill. I think all plovers have kind of a dove-like bill. It's sort of swollen at the tip. They're rather short, often pretty delicate. So even though it's not a perfect match, they do remind me of each other. And I always refer to plovers' bills as being rather dove-like. So you can see here, side by side, the snowy during winter and the semi-palmated during winter. The plumage is close enough to be mistaken at a distance of a quick look, but the legs are different colors. The snowy plover is far more compact and large-headed compared to the semi-palmated. It looks to be shorter with longer legs. It has a different proportion. Bigger head, smaller body, shorter from wingtip to bill tip for the snowy plover. Now its habitat is pretty different, this microhabitat. Now it's true you can find them together, but I most often associate snowy plover with this very salty, cakey, saline substrate. This is on A12, I believe, yeah, A12, right near the Alviso Marina. And these salt edges are just the right color for a snowy plover to kind of disappear in. And if it stands out against the bright white, it might move to those pale tan areas and blend in there. So this is not only where they like to forage throughout the year, but they also breed in areas like this. So anytime you see a bright sandy beach, or you see a really saline salt pan like this, with some water along the edges, you're likely to find snowy plover. And even though it's considered a rare bird and threatened on the West Coast, we are fortunate enough to have multiple breeding pairs in our county that are monitored annually. Marbled godwit, another big, obvious shorebird. It's good sized, it's loud, it has an extremely long bill that's slightly upturned. That bill is pink at the base and black at the tip. So it's pretty streamlined. It's pretty streamlined in flight, with long bill and long legs, long pointed wings. It's really a great looking flight silhouette. And notice all the cinnamon tones. You see that on both of our large shorebirds, the marbled godwit and the long-billed curlew. So like any of the long-billed shorebirds, you're likely to find them in soft, deep mud. The godwits and the curlews excel at probing deep in the mud for deeply embedded invertebrates, nudibranchs and crustaceans and worms. They love to dig around there, and their bills are quite sensitive all the way to the tip, so they can tell when they've found something, and they'll yank it up. And this is food that plover would never be able to find. And that's actually kind of an interesting point, because we've got many species of birds feeding in this one habitat here, these mud flats. And the way they're able to do it is by foraging for different kinds of food. They all have different abilities. They all find different kinds of food, and therefore they're not really competing in the usual sense. They're not collaborating either, but they are cooperatively feeding side by side and not really competing. I think that's pretty wonderful. The marbled godwits forms enormous flocks during our winter. Tens, hundreds, thousands of birds collecting in shallow water areas of the outer ponds, and even Charleston Slough and the nearby ponds. Long-billed curlew, just a little bit larger than the marbled godwit and far less common. Unlike the godwit, which is a wetland species, the long-billed curlew is a grassland species. So the curlew and the godwit both breed elsewhere, the long-billed curlew excelling in the prairie states, where it uses that long bill and those long legs to reach for grasshoppers and other large insects in the prairie. So it's not eating aquatic worms or anything in the prairie states. It's looking for grasshoppers and locusts and other things of that sort. You can sort of imagine that call as being curlew, curlee, curlee, curlew. That's, again, how the bird has gotten its name. And the long bill is self-explanatory. You can see that both the marbled godwit and the long-billed curlew have a lot of cinnamon coloration. Beautiful birds, make them both pretty visible at a distance, pretty identifiable at a distance too, because despite the fact that they're similar size, the two-toned bill of the godwit and the long down-curved bill of the curlew are usually pretty visible even when they fly overhead. Once again, long-billed birds like deep, wet mud. Now, there's a trick to finding these birds in these habitats that I'll get to a bit later. Whimbrel. The name was changed from simply whimbrel to Hudsonian whimbrel by virtue of the fact that it was split into two species, one from the Old World and one from the New. The New World one has a dark rump, whereas the Old World one has got a pale rump. And their, of course, breeding ranges are completely different. The whimbrel is like a small curlew. And instead of that long, kind of mournful curlew, it's got this chick, 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 chick. It's a very different call. And oftentimes you can pick one out just by hearing it in the distance, even if you can't see it, because they're very loud. So side by side, they're different size. The bill is thicker and shorter, and sometimes less curved than the curlew. That was actually both birds singing at the same time. So the curlew here in flight reveals the fact that it's got less cinnamon. In fact, no cinnamon on it. It's really a very grayish bird compared to the curlew, which is really the only bird you would likely confuse it with. It's dark, it's gray, it's mottled. I mean, it's tan, but it's grayer than the really cinnamon-colored curlew. And its preferred habitat is probably more coastal than you would think from the birds we see here on the bay. We do have them on the bay, but you're more likely to find them on the coast, sort of on rocky outcroppings, jetties, levees like this. So this scene here could be on one of our local South Bay ponds, but there are very few in the South Bay that have got rocks like this. There are a few. A8 comes to mind, but that's off limits to the public. And we also get these birds in the Palo Alto Baylands. They'll show up near the visitor center, and they'll show up at Charleston Slough and such, but they really do prefer to be on the coast, near the salt water. Wilson snipe, I think this is one of our last very obvious familiar birds. This is a shy bird that breeds in the northern boreal forests and also in the Arctic and also in the Sierra. So it breeds a lot, it breeds pretty widely. It's a real skulker. It loves to hide in the grass, in the reeds, in the marsh. It loves to stand completely still. And only when it comes out and reveals itself do you see the lovely plumage on it. It's filled with wooden tones, chestnuts, ebony, walnuts. It's just filled with tans and golds and browns and rufous. It's a simply beautifully marked bird. And in many ways, it looks a lot like a dowitcher. But there's only one dowitcher in this picture. It's the one in the middle with its head down. And you can see that the pattern on the birds is a bit different. Most importantly, and probably most helpful, the Wilson snipe never has a white wedge like the two dowitchers on the back. It's got parallel stripes from the neck down to the tail. Generally, it appears darker and more colorful than the dowitchers. But that's something you could look for. As you see a long-billed, short-legged bird zip past you, look at the back. Look at the rump. Do you see white? Do you see pale gray? That would tell you whether it's a snipe or whether it's a dowitcher. It might not tell you which dowitcher, but it'll tell you it's a dowitcher. Black oystercatcher, probably one of the most obvious and easy to identify shorebirds we have is the black oystercatcher. That's now a familiar sound on Shoreline Lake, where they've taken up breeding recently. The past few years, they've done something they haven't done for, as far as I remember, ever, which was breeding in Santa Clara County. And the way to find them is to go to Shoreline Lake in the spring and look on the island where the skimmers and the terns and the avocets and stilts breed. And you might just see a single pair of black oystercatchers there. But as I call them, brown oystercatchers, because they really are brownish on the back and wings. They're not really black at all. I think it's a peculiar name for such a bird. Anyway, that huge red bill and that orange eye with the red eye ring make it pretty hard to mistake with anything else. Again, breeding in the South Bay, breeding in Santa Clara County is a recent phenomenon. And it's not a common habitat for it to be in. This is where the bird generally is found, right on the coast on a rocky shore with waves crashing against the rocks. The same place you would tend to find turnstones or surf birds or the whimbrel. This is the kind of place that the oystercatchers and the whimbrel really like. Coastal bluffs with rocks and crashing waves. Large outcroppings just offshore. So we're very lucky to have the black oystercatcher nesting in our county. And again, up until recently, it was considered very rare. Here's the little island at Shoreline Lake, and we're looking toward Charleston Slough. Spotted sandpiper. This is not a common bird, but it's not difficult to find either. Its habitat is very specific. It likes reservoirs, it likes creeks, it likes small ponds and lakes. And what it does is it forages along the shore, walking pretty constantly, pretty nervously, bobbing its tail up and down incessantly. So in the spring, it shows spots on the breast, but that plumage is very short-lived. For most of the year, they are spotless sandpipers, and they still bob their tail, but you'll notice also this peculiar barring on the wings. That particular pattern, that fringing pattern, is unique to the spotted sandpiper, and it's something you could look for. The other thing you could look for with spotted sandpiper is this, what I call rubber band flight, where it makes quick bursts of rapid wing beats on wings that are sort of bowed, held pointed downward. And it'll do that while calling. So this is not only a courtship display, it's also a territorial display or an alarm call. And it's just its way of flying. It's a very unique, very recognizable way. And the European counterpart, the common sandpiper, looks almost identical and does the very same thing. Has that rubber band flight, which if you haven't seen it, it's worth looking for because it'll help you recognize the bird in the absence of any other field marks. That was a call. And its microhabitat is also very specific and very recognizable. I think this is Lake Cunningham here. Spotted sandpipers, like I said, are not gregarious. They're solitary, and they like fresh water. They like creeks, they like ponds and lakes and reservoirs. So they'll be foraging along the edges, and if you startle them, they'll fly off over the water on those bowed wings, calling and giving those rapid rubber band wing beats. They're pretty common in an area like this. You could see 2 or 3, maybe even 4 birds at Lake Cunningham, Lake Almaden, Shoreline Lake. You occasionally get them, but you're never going to see flocks of them. They're very solitary. All right. So this is where I stop and I ask if anybody has any questions about that sort of easier stuff, anything at all. And if you do, you could unmute yourself and ask.
Hey, I have a kind of a silly question.
It's not a silly question.
Well,
Just
it
go
just
ahead.
happened last week. So I went out to Palo Alto Baylands with Chris and John, and I just picked a time, not thinking about the tides. And so it happened to be new moon and high tides. So there were like no shorebirds hardly at all. Where do they go when all the water comes in? That's my question.
That's a great question, and I'm going to talk more about it later, but I'll give you a quick answer now. Since most of the shorebirds are drawn to the mud and drawn to the edge of the water, when the water's too high and there's no shore, there's no mud able for them to walk on or forage on, they go to places where they can find it, or they go to places where they can just rest. So if you were Charleston Slough or Palo Alto Baylands during the highest tide, you'd want to, in the case of Palo Alto Baylands, probably look in the marsh, in those small ponds off of the parking lot. That'd be a good place to look. A lot of them will go there. Many others will fly into the bay, into portions of the bay that do have jetties or a small shoreline that they can collect on. But during that time, many shorebirds can't feed. So the next best thing for them to do is to rest. So they'll find a place that's safe, and they'll rest if they can't find a place that allows them to feed. So hopefully that gives you a quick answer.
Matthew, Julie Rose here.
Hi there.
Hi, this is fabulous. I'm going to have to watch this 40 times, but I'm getting some of it finally.
All right, great.
So there's a group of birds having been visiting my mom and Chico in Llano Seco.
Yep.
Okay, so it's after the ducks have left. What is the small bird? I've been thinking the whole time it was sandpipers. What are the small birds that fly around in flocks? I don't know if we've gone over that yet or not, or if it was
no. It could be any of our wintering shorebird species. If you're sure it's a shorebird.
They're teeny. Yeah.
Okay.
It's a shorebird, and they're small, but I've seen them here, and I've seen them at Llano Seco.
Well,
And
my first guess would be least sandpiper.
least sandpiper.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and
Okay.
you could also be western sandpipers, but I think the least are they're smallest for sure, and they do form large flocks. Now, if you're farther away and you're not able to tell the size of the birds, I would also consider dowitchers. But
Okay. No, they're not. They weren't dowitchers. No. I was right there. 20 feet when they're there and then they'd fly off. Because, okay, so which sandpiper, this is least sandpiper that are in flocks. Spotted sandpiper is the solitary one, or just two or three.
Right, right. Mhm.
Okay,
So
thank you.
you're welcome. Good to hear your voice. All right. So if there are no more questions, I'm going to move on to some tougher stuff.
Wait,
Oh
I
yeah,
would like to ask a question.
sure.
Um, I was just wondering, where would be the best place to see the Wilson snipe when they come over?
A freshwater marsh. So I would recommend the Coast Casey forebay would be a good place along the edges. Scan the
Mm,
edges at the water's edge, at the base of the plants. Also, the Gold and Elizabeth, the small islands tend to collect numbers of snipes there. I haven't seen any yet this season, so it's possible they haven't arrived yet. But I would look at places where the water is still. You don't want rushing
mm,
tidal waves or anything. You want still water, most likely fresh, but they will also go to salt water. Look for vegetation that they can hide in. And
mm,
a lot of times they'll be on the small islands at Gold and Elizabeth. They'll be occasionally at the entrance road to EEC, but generally they would be in the creek, not at the New Chicago Marsh.
mm.
So another place would be Emily Renzel wetlands. If the vegetation has been cut recently and you can see into the marsh and base of the plants. So the short answer is fresh, still water that provides a lot of vegetation for cover.
Mm. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so I'm gonna continue, and we're gonna talk a little bit about juvenile birds. Juvenile birds have what we call juvenile plumage, spelled differently. And juvenile plumage is very different from this adult. This is a spring adult least sandpiper, and what you should notice is that the plumage is very crisp. We're getting nice division between the pattern and the base color. We're seeing rufous on the scapulars. We're seeing nicely scalloped coverts on the wings. We're seeing crisp markings, and it looks clean. That's actually a good call to memorize if you can, because it's quite common and they're very distinctive sound. As the bird advances through summer, you'll see the white edges of the scapulars and the coverts start to wear away. White feathers wear away more quickly than dark feathers, and that's because the melanin that causes the dark brown and black coloration actually has a strengthening property that prevents the feathers from wearing away. So what we see is we see the dark brown colors, but we see less of the white edging on those feathers, and that gives the bird more of a blurry appearance. The pattern becomes less distinct. It's a little harder to figure out, but all the feathers have started to soften and even fade, which would make the bird, as it gets to winter, to be kind of a mess. And the feathers, all the white has worn off of the wings and the scapulars in the back. We don't see the really crisp, scaly pattern any longer. The markings on the breast are all blurry and messy. This because this bird has just finished breeding. It's exhausted, and it's using this time during the winter to grow new feathers, which will look more like the spring feathers. But until then, it's going to look kind of worn, faded, brown, and fuzzy. Now, this time of year, when most of the winter least sandpipers look something like this, worn out, feathers kind of broken or fringed away, the young birds show up with brand new plumage. It's crisp, it's colorful, it's shiny, it's beautiful. They are young as the spring morning, and they are here looking fabulous. So their adults are tired. They need to molt those old feathers and get new ones. But until that happens, the young birds, the juveniles, are going to look pretty flashy by comparison. Now, all shorebirds have a juvenile plumage, and western sandpiper's got a juvenile plumage too. It is frostier by comparison, and there's much less of the rufous coloration, and it's confined to the scapulars. I call these suspenders. So they are, like the straps on a backpack almost. They're wrapped around the upper edge of the wing. The rest of the bird is snowy white. If you look at the least sandpiper to the right, you see not only the shorter bill, not only the yellow legs, not only the additional color of on the back, the rufous and the coloration, you see more patterning on the breast. Sometimes this patterning begins to resemble a bib, which the western sandpiper tends not to have. It's very frosty and white-breasted. So those are two basic juvenile birds in juvenile plumage.
Can you show where these suspenders are? Can you point to it?
I don't know if you can see my mouse. You see under the abbreviation Western Sandpiper, WESA,
Yes.
you see a little bit of red on the kind of the going left to right.
Yes.
That's the
it.
scapulars.
Okay.
Those are the feathers that smooth out the transition between the back and the wing. So when the wing is outstretched, the scapulars remain close to the body, whereas the rest of the wing stretches out in front of it.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's compare a few birds, and a lot of these are going to be juveniles. So again, the adult of the least sandpiper this time of year, fall and winter, is what I call brownie, because she's very tan, brown. The plumage is blurry. It's not crisp at all. The juvenile, by comparison, is really crisp and frosty and really nice. And Western sandpiper I also call frosty because it's so pale and really, the gray is grayer than the brown of the least sandpiper. A lot more white on the face. And then, of course, the juvenile is similarly white, but has these red suspenders. So I'm seeing both of these species in adult and juvenile plumage right now. This weekend, in fact, we were seeing numbers of both. So this is a great time of year to look for the juveniles. Here we have two adults, western on the left, least on the right. The leg color is different, black for the western, yellowish or mustard color for the least. It's not obvious that the western sandpiper's bill is longer because the least is partly submerged, but they are generally a longer, more noticeably longer bill than the least sandpiper. It took me until a few minutes ago to realize that these are dead fish that the sandpipers are foraging around. There must be a lot of insects drawn to the fish there. Anyway, so here again we've got the juveniles, western on the left, least on the right. There's more color on the wings of the least. The spotting on the breast is more pronounced. The bird generally looks browner than the kind of frosty white western on the left. Now, with those two, there is a difference in size and a difference in structure. It might become easier when we look at more images of these two species. But the least is more compact, and the western always appears to me to be more front heavy. The head seems larger in relation to the body. It seems to lean forward more, and that long bill kind of accentuates that property. You've got the other features, the streaky brown, the streaky gray, short pointed bill as opposed to long and drooped bill, yellowish versus black legs, the red suspenders. So there are some plumage features there that you can use to differentiate them. But I would encourage you to start looking at the way the way their size compares and the way they hold their bodies, how they compare, and how that long bill affects your perception of the bird's silhouette. Now, larger still is the dunlin, which has a very long bill, black legs, and I'll get into the face in a moment, but the head appears smaller in relation to the body because it's a larger bird. And that's typical for larger birds to have what appears to be a smaller head in relation to the body. So Same thing with eyes. Eyes appear smaller on larger birds. It has what I think many people call a hunched posture, a humpback. We'll see that the next couple of images, I think. During the spring, Dunlin is fantastically beautiful. It's been called the red-backed sandpiper or the black-bellied sandpiper. And unfortunately, we very rarely see anything like this at our latitude. This is an Arctic breeder, and by the time we see it in fall, it started to lose most of that color. And as we advance towards winter, like the upper right-hand bird, we see it becoming even smoother and less less colorful. Now, the bird on the lower right differs from the winter adult in that the coverts on the wings are a little bit more scaly looking. They have pale fringe on the outside, and those feathers are still quite rounded. That's because this is an immature bird, and the juvenile plumage, this is where that scaly, fringy edging of the young juvenile feathers is visible. So side by side, the Dunlin and the Western Sandpiper, there's a pretty big difference. They both have black legs, they both have a lot of gray, they both have a fair amount of white, but you see the much longer bill on the Dunlin and the shorter bill on the Western Sandpiper. This is probably a male Western because that bill is so short. If it were a female, I think we would see a longer bill that is closer but still falls short of the Dunlin's bill. Notice also how much white there is on the chin and breast of the Western Sandpiper, and how the Dunlin has a bit of a bib below the chin. There's a dark, blurry area that is quite different from the Western Sandpiper. In flight, being a larger bird with longer wings, the wing beats are slower. It always appears more uniformly colored than the two Western or least sandpipers on the right. And it has what I always think of as being a very plain face. It doesn't have much in the way of a supercilium or any facial features that give it much of an expression. So it tends to look fairly dull in its expression. Here we have another juvenile Dunlin, upper right, because of the scalloping on the coverts. And we have what looks like a juvenile least sandpiper that's advanced toward winter plumage. There's a pretty big difference between these two right here in size. All right, if anybody has questions about these comparisons, feel free to interject if you feel the need. If not, I'm going to move to least and petrel sandpiper. Now, I think these two, the plumage is actually pretty similar at times. They both have a lot of rufous, they both have a lot of sort of golden coloration, and they both have yellowish legs, the petrel being more yellow. But I would point to the pronounced bib on the front of the petrel sandpiper and the yellow at the base of the bill. These are plumage and coloration differences that you can pick out, but I think the bigger thing to notice would be the size of these two birds. So petrel sandpiper, because the plumage is so similar in color and pattern as the least sandpiper, I've often called this the greater least sandpiper, just because it looks like a giant least sandpiper. In fact, many times people have sent me a picture asking if this is a petrel sandpiper, and it turns out it's a least, or vice versa. So separated from each other and being seen independent of each other, it could be easy to mistake them, but the petrel sandpiper is much larger. And that thing I mentioned about the size of the head is important here, because the tiny head of a petrel sandpiper is the same size as the large head on a least sandpiper. Those heads are the same size, and yet look at the size difference between the head and the body of each of those two birds. So like I said, large birds have smaller heads in relation to the body. It's just the way they develop. And it has longer wings and more pointed wings. This is an indication that it's a very long distance migrant, flying all the way, sometimes from the Arctic Circle to Patagonia, basically halfway around the world. These long wings make that flight somewhat easier than the shorter, more rounded wings of the least sandpiper. So western and semi-palmated, I'm only going to talk about this briefly because this is a fairly rare bird, but it has shown up 3 times already this season. Western sandpiper here, you can see the nice long bill. This is a juvenile. And you can also see that sort of front heavy posture that I mentioned. It looks like it's leaning forward more than a least sandpiper. It almost looks like it's going to tip over and dunk its bill in the water. The semi-palmated sandpiper has the scaling pattern of a young bird, but has a really short, blunt bill. It's not pointed, it's very blunt, and has a lot of white on the face and breast like western sandpiper, but it pretty much lacks all the reddish tones. So it doesn't have those red suspenders. In fact, it's pretty grayish overall compared to the western sandpiper. And I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the reason why we're talking so much about juvenile birds in relation to these rather rare birds is that when we get these rare birds, they're almost always juveniles. It's quite common for juveniles to lose their way or get thrown west to our coast when the majority of those birds migrate through the prairie states or through the eastern seaboard, and they're flying all the way down to Central or South America. But because they nest so high, because they fledge so high in the Arctic, if they make a small miscalculation at the very north end of their journey, it's easy for them to end up on the west coast. And we get a lot of juveniles that do just that, including nearly every single semi-palmated sandpiper, petrel sandpiper, and Baird's. Now, the place I look for semi-palmated sandpiper is usually in the shallower ponds along the boardwalk, and then also along the entrance road to Don Edwards Preserve. Both of these birds like to wade in the water, but they also forage along the dry edges. And the boardwalk is a great place to look for both of these species, particularly the rarer semi-palmated sandpiper. Western and Baird's sandpiper. Baird's, I'll have to tell you right now, is my favorite shorebird. It's a little bit larger than a western sandpiper, but it's completely different in its posture and its silhouettes, its structure and all. The primaries extend well beyond the tail. You can see that in the diagram. The tertials are quite long, and for the most part, the tertials cover other shorebirds' primaries. In this case, the primaries extend well beyond the tertials and well beyond the tail. That's very unusual for our shorebirds. In fact, I think there's only 1 or 2 others that do that. So I would, ask you, what is the question mark pointing to? Does anybody have a thought what that might be? Okay, that's the other wing. Those are the other primaries from the left-hand wing. The label primaries is pointing to the right-hand wing. Closer to us. Now, when I say that the wings are extended, I really do mean that. Look how long those wings extend beyond the tail and how long that makes the sandpiper look. That's why I sometimes call this the long peep. This bird is much longer, and to me that kind of equates with elegance. This bird looks more elegant and perhaps graceful than the western or least sandpipers. This bird has beautifully long wings, and again, this suggests that it's a long-distance migrant. You can see here the Baird's sandpiper compared to the western sandpiper, and the difference in the length of the body and the length of the wings is pretty clear. Now, where I look for Baird's sandpiper is almost always on the dry, cakey, muddy substrate of places like Don Edwards. So now, when I say that I find them here, that I always look for them in these places, that's my personal experience. The field guides might say could be found in marshes or wetlands, But I like to go a little bit farther and kind of specify within each of those areas something that's more helpful to me. And I always tend to find Baird sandpipers on kind of a cakey, dried, packed, dried mud area like this. Long-billed dowitcher as opposed to the ruff. So ruff is another rare bird. We haven't had one yet this season, but I expect we'll get one. All juveniles. This is unique among our shorebirds in that it is sexually dimorphic. There's about a 25 to 30% difference in size between the large male and the small female. And this is because this is a lek nesting bird. So like grouse and like hummingbirds, it'll display, attract females, it'll mate with them, and that tends to produce a sexually dimorphic species, with the males being larger. Grouse are much larger than the female grouse, and the ruff is larger than the female ruff. The other one that comes to mind is buff-breasted sandpiper, where the female is smaller than the male. In any case, like all the juveniles that we see of these rare species, they're always scaly. Look at the back and the wings, how scaly and how well defined those feathers are. They've got nice crisp edges. They're beautiful. And even here, this bird farther into winter still shows really nice scaling on the wings. But look how short the bill is. So this to me is kind of a stumpy bill bird. It's rotund, it's round-bodied, fairly short-necked, and short-billed. It looks oddly proportioned. This is also an old world species. So we never get a lot of them, but the West Coast is particularly good at getting them. Now compare, that bill length to the similarly sized dowitchers, the long-billed dowitchers, left and right. So it does stand out. And this bird is likely a female because she's close in size to the dowitcher. Again, the ruff has shown up along Grand Boulevard at the entrance of Don Edwards many times over the years. And it can be found on the edges of the shallow ponds. It can also be found in the vegetation. So in my experience, the ruff tends to go to places where there is some vegetation for it to forage in. Could be in New Chicago Marsh along the boardwalk even. I've seen them there from time to time where it's foraging in the grass, not just on the shore. So greater yellowlegs and ruff. This ruff is probably a male by virtue of the fact that it's nearly the size of the greater yellowlegs. Again, look at the short bill compared to the yellowlegs. I would also point out the lack of spots on the ruff. It doesn't ever have spots. It always has either bars on the wings, but usually kind of solid wings. The greater yellowlegs has lots of spots. So there's a plumage difference between these two, although the legs are fairly yellow on this individual. And look at how white the face is on the ruff. Again, here with greater yellowlegs, very, very white face. Plumage patterning is very different. Doesn't have the spots of the greater yellowlegs. It does have a very short bill. But look how kind of oddly proportioned that bird is with a short neck and the short bill. It's just curiously built. Greater and lesser yellowlegs. This is one of the more common pairs of birds that we might come across. Lesser yellowlegs is less common. It's not rare, but it is less common. It's got a very short bill that's scarcely longer than the length of its own head. It has a shorter neck, and it's about 2/3 the size of the greater yellowlegs. Greater yellowlegs has a bill that can sometimes appear slightly upturned and longer for sure. That's the greater yellowlegs. And that's the lesser yellowlegs. So a little softer call, not quite as piercing as greater yellowlegs. Here, the size difference is apparent, and the arrow is pointing to this kind of curious bump in the neck. Sort of reminds me of an Adam's apple or something. And this is something you see pretty regularly on greater yellowlegs. The neck is longer and it's lankier. It has this curious bump in it that's not as smooth like a lesser yellowlegs. So you'll see another lesser yellowlegs with longer, the neck is stretched out more and it's much more smooth than the greater. It tends to have less barring and spotting on the breast as well. Both of the yellowlegs have white rumps like this. This looks like, we'll just take a guess. Is this a greater or a lesser? You know, judging by the length of the bill and the shape of the bill, it looks slightly upturned, looks longer than the head, noticeably longer. So this would be a greater yellowlegs. Lesser yellowlegs probably should be compared to solitary sandpiper, which is in the same genus. They're both Tringa. Instead of having bright yellow legs, it has olive legs. It's darker backed and has a really prominent feature on the face we'll see in a minute. But you see less spotting on it. It's a smaller bird with less spotting, darker coloration overall. Kind of the same length bill in relation to the head, I would say. But most importantly, the tail is dark. The center part of the tail, at least, is dark. This is very unusual for our Tringas. They always have white tails. This one does not. And it also has these obvious spectacles, not only an eye ring, but kind of spectacles like the Cassin's vireo on the right. When they land, they often hold their wings up for a couple of seconds, and they reveal that the underwings on the solitary sandpiper are heavily patterned and dark, as opposed to the lesser yellowlegs, which is white and relatively unpatterned. Now, I only point this out because both of these birds have a tendency to hold their wings up briefly before they fold them after they've landed. So this is something that you're very likely to see if you come across these two birds. The habitat of solitary sandpiper is very different from most of our other shorebirds. The only other shorebird that shares this kind of creekside habitat would be spotted sandpiper. And they also can be found together on small reservoirs, small lakes, but the solitary sandpiper really likes these freshwater creeks. In fact, its migration sometimes follows these creeks. Spotted sandpiper and solitary sandpiper. They might think this is a strange comparison, but I think actually it's pretty reasonable to compare them. They both have eye rings. They both bob their tails. But the spotted sandpiper has a kind of a spur of white that goes up the side of the neck, which is different. And hopefully you would be able to see them open wings or the rubber band flight of the spotted sandpiper to tell them apart. But at least plumage-wise, I can see why they might be mistaken until you see them or hear them fly. The body structure is somewhat different. The solitary is elegant and methodical and precise in the way it feeds. The spotted sandpiper is a little bit more solidly built, shorter legged by comparison, and more active and nervous than the solitary. But beware, they can be found together. Dowitchers. This is everybody's worst nightmare, a flock of dowitchers. The white wedge on the back is almost unique among our shorebirds. I can think of the black-necked stilts have them and the black turnstones have it, but other than that, that white wedge on the back is really, every time you see it, it's almost always going to be a dowitcher. This is a bad picture, but it shows what we normally associate with dowitchers, which is constant sewing machine type probing in the mud. They do this constantly looking for food. In fall, the adults are pretty similar. What I would point out is that the long-billed dowitcher has got kind of a uniform dark neck and breast, whereas the short-billed has a lighter throat and a more spotting but less uniform grayish. You can also look at the feathers on the back and see that the short-billed dowitcher's got dark interior, whereas the long-billed are more uniform. But the Easiest way to tell them apart is, of course, by sound. That was the long-billed. It's squeaky and high, and here's the short-billed. Now, they might strike you as pretty similar, but the short-billed to me sounds a little softer, a little bit more muted, not so piercing. It's also less commonly called. So I think you can go on which one you're hearing more often too. Now the juveniles is where it really becomes manageable for everybody to identify the two dowitchers. And this is the time to look for these juveniles. The fall juvenile long-billed dowitcher has plain tertials. The fall juvenile short-billed dowitcher has patterned tertials, which have this kind of interesting tiger striping inside of the feather. Now I point this out because the adults are going to look like this, gray, all gray and fairly similar looking. The short-billed and long-billed young birds are quite different. The color on the long-billed is confined mostly to the scapulars and the back, whereas the color of the short-billed is suffused all the way through the tertials and the coverts of the wings, and even the body looks more colorful. So those are two dowitchers, which at this time of the year are pretty easy to separate. Just remember that you're going to see more long-bills because they're closer, they're more inland species. The short-billed are more toward the bay or on the coast, but we do have them here and they can be found together. So just watch for that. Here's just another example of the short-billed patterning on the tertials and the long-billed lack of patterning. And here again, you can see the short-billed on the left with much more color on the back and wings, the long-billed with very little color, mostly confined at the back. And the dowitchers both love to forage in groups like this or rest in groups like this. This is Coast Casey forebay. Now, if you were to look through this group, I could almost guarantee you'd find some short bills, but they're almost all going to be long bills at this place in the bay. Now, if you want to learn how to compare the sounds and you happen to have the Scvba app, here's a good way to do it. You pull up one of the dowitchers and you look in the lower right of the menu bar, and you'll see this weird sort of wishbone arrow. That will open up similar birds that you can compare it to. You click on the short-billed dowitcher, and it'll show you the short-billed dowitcher and the long-billed dowitcher together on the same page, and you can scroll them independently. I've scrolled them both to reveal the juvenile of each species, the short-billed at the top, the long-billed at the bottom. And the little musical note on the bottom right will pull up both of the birds' recorded songs. And you can go back and forth and listen to these over and over and over again. And you could use it in the field to remind you which one you're hearing. So I encourage you to give that a try because it works quite well. Anyway, finally, any questions on those comparisons that I can answer? Okay, we're wrapping up rapidly. When I say way out there, I'm talking about the outer ponds in Alviso and Mountain View. These areas wrapped in red here. And A16 is where the Environmental Education Center is. You can see that on the sort of right-hand side, right of center. And the Stevens Creek Trail is over there, AB1, A2W, A2E, that area, that's Stevens Creek Trail. Let's talk briefly about the phalaropes. This time of year, right now, this past weekend, Cricket and I saw thousands of red-necked phalaropes. There was one red-necked phalarope in this picture, and I'm hoping that you can pick it out because it looks quite different from the other Wilson's phalaropes surrounding it. It's the middle bird on the top row. Now, phalaropes are famous for a couple of things. One is they're polyandrous, which means that the male takes care of incubating the eggs and building a nest and exposing the children to where to find food. And they're famous for spinning in place while they're in the water, in the in the effort to bring aquatic life to the surface where they can eat it. They can't dive, but they can certainly swim, but they just float on the top. So they need the food to come to them. But they have the advantage of feeding in an area where other shorebirds are not. That's quite a good thing. And as I pointed out earlier, redneck phalaropes particularly have this wonderful cycle where we see them on the way up and on the way down. We see them coming and going. And of course, when they're going north, they're heading to the party where they're going to meet their date and they're going to start a family. And on the way down, that arrow should be pointing down, I guess. When on their way down, by that time, they have pretty much molted out of their party clothes and they're wearing their winter coat. So that explains why they look the way they do this time of year. Again, the breeding plumages of red-necked and Wilson's phalaropes are stunningly beautiful, especially with the females, which are vividly colored. And in the wintertime, they drab out like this. Now notice the streaking and the patterning on this bird, the red-necked phalarope. And this is the juvenile. Like I said before, the juveniles often have a lot of color that the adults do not have. Wilson's phalarope, again, here's an adult female during spring. Here she is during winter. It would be difficult to mistake those two with each other. And here is the fall juvenile, again, very, very colorful. So winter adult, side by side, the two species, very different. The Wilson's is a little bit longer necked and larger bird, but not by much, but definitely paler and more uniform. And then in flight, you can see that the Wilson's has got a pale rump, very much like a yellow legs, and the red-necked has a dark tail and much streaking and patterning on the back and very dark coloration overall. Sanderling. Sanderling's quite rare in our county. If you go to San Mateo County coast, you'll see them by the hundreds or thousands on the beaches, chasing the waves. What they're doing is they're waiting for the water to recede so they can reach the invertebrate in the mud or sand, and then they run away from the waves as it rushes back in. They're fairly large. They're much larger than western sandpipers, although the coloration is pretty similar. They're both really frosty. But I would, point out that the black shoulder patch on the Sanderling does separate it from the western sandpiper. And in flight, that black forewing is really apparent, and it's completely missing on a western sandpiper. But you're never going to see this in the large numbers that we see the western sandpipers in our county. There are many fewer, one or two or three Sanderlings maybe, generally in the outer ponds. Red knots, we very rarely see it with red on the breast, but occasionally we do in late winter before they depart or early spring before they depart for the Arctic Circle, or sometimes in late fall as they arrive here. This is what they look like in winter, which is very frosty gray. You might think, again, this looks a lot like a western sandpiper, but it's much larger. It's the size of a black-bellied plover, and there's one red knot in winter plumage here mixed in with these black-bellied plovers. I'm pretty sure you can spot it there. It's the fourth from the left. Where I would recommend looking for this bird would be at the end of the new Song Sparrow Trail, which is an offshoot of the Stevens Creek Trail. I'll show you on the map where it is. As the tide recedes and exposes all the glorious mud, you'll find shorebirds gathering by the thousands out here. And red knots tend to be pretty far out there, so a scope is recommended. But this would be one of the better ways to find a red knot, either here or the Stevens Creek Delta. Turnstones. There are two kinds of turnstones that we get. They're both about the same rarity here, but I'm going to talk mostly about black. The ruddy on the right, you can recognize it pretty easily in any plumage because the black bib has got a large white mark inside of the black. So it ends up looking like a black O rather than a bib. Also, you'll notice that there's much more white on the side of the breast as opposed to the black turnstone on the left-hand side. This is the kind of habitat they like: rocky coastal outcroppings where the waves rush in and splash onto the rocks, bringing food from the ocean. They have a harlequin pattern. Both kinds of turnstones have got this harlequin pattern. Again, one of the few birds that has a white back in North America. Where you used to look for these birds is temporarily closed for, I think, 2 years. This is out by the Broken Levee in Alviso. I'll show you on the map where this is. But the reason the turnstones like it here is because of the rocky coast. It's jagged. It's windswept. There's actually sometimes kind of a tide here, and there are waves from the wind. It appeals to turnstones and to surf birds and to oyster catchers and things of that sort that like the rocky coast. Pacific golden plover. I said I was going to talk a little bit about this, and that's what I'll do now. Pacific golden plovers almost always show some obvious gold coloration. Maybe not a lot, maybe not widespread, but at least some. Pacific golden plover can be mistaken for a black belly, especially in fall, but the black belly bird on the right has got the white rump and the black axillaries. Both of those things are lacking on the golden plover. So if you see what looks like a black belly plover, but you see a dark rump and you don't see any black axillaries, you're probably looking at a golden plover. Now, an observant birder would probably notice the slight more golden tone of this Pacific golden plover mixed in with the black bellies, and also the one willet, it looks like. An even more observant birder would notice how much more delicate the bill looks and how large the eye looks on that head. This is a smaller bird with larger eyes than the black-bellied plover. And where it is often shown up is right at New Chicago Marsh along the entrance road to EEC at Dot Edwards. Usually hanging out with killdeer because they are fairly closely related, and they both like that mud substrate there. And the golden plover seems to have an affinity for vegetation too, so it might nestle into the plants a bit. So I'm gonna wrap up by telling you a few places to go, including some very specific places on those outer ponds. Unless people have questions at the moment, I think I'll continue.
Wait, I was just curious, where did you see the thousands of phalaropes that you mentioned earlier?
Hey, Melody, how are you doing?
Good.
I hope to see you in the office pretty soon.
Yeah.
I saw your reports recently. The thousands of phalaropes were on the outer ponds. We started at the Alviso Marina, and we went all the way around counterclockwise past A15 and A16 and A12, and I'll show you on the map in just a moment. There were many more red-necked than Wilsons, but still we saw both species in good numbers.
Cool.
I think the actual pond was A9 where we saw the most, but I'll show you on the map.
All right, thank you.
Sure. All right, so I don't know what this black slide is. One thing to remember, at least in my experience, I find most shorebirds, the greatest numbers of shorebirds on a receding tide. So I like to time my visits after the tide has peaked and it's on its way down, perhaps even halfway down. The reason for that is that at Palo Alto Baylands, this lagoon will empty out. And when it empties out, you'll see thousands of shorebirds during fall and winter. So that's my philosophy. Now, if I did exactly the opposite and saw that the tide was rising and that there were no mudflats, I would look in the ponds in the marsh. You can see one barely on the edge on the right-hand side of the screen. I would look in there for where the birds rest when there's no feeding grounds available to them. So getting a tide app is sometimes pretty helpful. And I would make the same recommendation at Charleston Slough. Here we see Coast Casey Forebay on the right, and we see Charleston Slough on the left. If the slough is filled with water and there's no mud, look in the Coast Casey Forebay, where the shorebirds might be gathering. If the tide is low and the Coast Casey Forebay is empty of birds, look on the mudflats on Charleston Slough, and you might find the birds feeding there. Again, it's either about feeding or resting for those birds. And I've talked a lot about Don Edwards and New Chicago Marsh and the various microhabitats that are visible in this picture. Now, to Melody's question here, A16, that's Don Edwards is on the lower, the southeastern edge of A16, right there in the corner is where the visitor center is. And if you take the trail counterclockwise up to the first red dot, that's the platform. That area at the right time of day, when the water is the right level, will host thousands of shorebirds of various kinds. Right now, there are black skimmers and Caspian terns that have been nesting there, so they're still in really good numbers. Thousands of shorebirds are gathering there, willets, avocets, stilts, sandpipers of various kinds, black-bellied plovers, and semi-palmated plovers. A17 is also very tidal, and that becomes completely muddy and filled with shorebirds when the tide is out, and when the tide is full, they go someplace else. That red line is the off limits area currently because of restoration. It was closed during the snowy plover breeding season, but it's closed now because of restoration and habitat refurbishment. That's going to be closed for, I think, a couple of years. But you can get all the way around all of those ponds on bicycle or on foot. And A9 is where Melody was just asking about. That's where we saw all the many phalaropes. This was Saturday. So I think they're still going to be there. Now, two other places I mentioned are the Stevens Creek Marsh, the Stevens Creek Delta. If you take the Stevens Creek Trail north, it'll take a 45-degree turn to the east, and that will take you to a dead end with a beautiful view of Stevens Creek Delta. Now, if you had gotten on the west edge of the Stevens Creek, you would follow a new trail that leads along the east side of A2W. That will take you 1.5 miles out to a dead end and a bench, and that is called the Song Sparrow Trail. And that Song Sparrow Trail, that mud flat, is where I recommend you might look for red knot. And yeah. Now, for those longer trails out in the outer ponds, I strongly recommend a bicycle. It's the way I get around out there, but you can walk. It's just a long walk. But you know, walking that distance might actually allow you to see some things that I miss when I'm speeding past on a bike. But I strap my tripod to the back of my bike and take some snacks with me and my binocs strapped around my neck, and I'm all set to go. So I love those ponds. I love biking out there. It's lonely and wonderful out there. Tons of birds. Finally, resources. Our new checklist just published last month, and it's got recent name changes, some taxonomic changes. It has a new species. The dark-sided flycatcher has finally been added. Thank you, Eve, for that one. And the Shorebird Guide is out of print, unfortunately, but you can still find it. And it may fill in some of the blanks that are left in your field guide. But you know, one or two of these resources will get you pretty far. If you have all three of them, you're in the best possible shape. Finally, I always recommend this, and I know you've probably heard it before, but I strongly recommend when you're studying any birds of any kind, go to the search photos and sound section of the eBird site, particularly the Explore section. Click on that and you'll see some birds show up. If you type in a species name where it says green species right there, you can type in some additional filters, like I want the pectoral sandpiper, I want it to be seen in California during these months, and I want it to be shown with multiple species. Now, what that does is it gives you a bunch of pictures that show your target pectoral sandpiper with a bunch of other birds. Your job then is to pick the pectoral sandpiper out of the bunch and notice what birds it's hanging out with and how it compares in size. What does it look like during this time of year? And those kinds of things. I think this is incredibly useful if you're trying to brush up on shorebirds and perhaps even gulls. Make sure you click that. It's not found under more filters. You click the multiple species tag. And finally, next month, I think on the 21st, we'll be doing a similar class on gulls, which we're going to be talking about 8 species in detail, but only 8 species, and all of which are quite common. So hopefully we'll see some of you there. Now,